So we're underway again here with Teddy, here at his home in Billings, and wanted to talk about some specific issues relating particularly to legislation. And of course, the first thing that comes to mind is the 1964 Wilderness Act. And wondering, Teddy was there, he was on site, and wondering about comments that he may have about the nuts and bolts, the mechanics, dynamics, and evolution. It took about 7 years, I believe, from initial introduction. Mm-hmm. Lee Metcalf from the get-go was a big supporter of the Wilderness Act, and later for the Montana Wilderness Study Act. And wondering about Teddy's knowledge, which is great, and any interesting anecdotes about that whole process of a bipartisan bill, the Wilderness Act of 1964, which passed the Senate in an overwhelming vote a year before it was ultimately passed. Tell me about your presence for the Wilderness Act of 1964.
Well, I think I'm going to disappoint you.
Ah!
Again, it's something that I believed in, but when I worked for Mike Mansfield on the Senate floor, my job was more administrative in the beginning, and while I might service a member on a particular topic, basically it was waving the legislation onto the floor and off to the floor to the president or over to the House. So I didn't have a great background in it. I went to work for Lee I went to work for Mike Mansfield and in 1961, and the act was passed in mid-1964, which means that even if I had been more exposed to the Wilderness Act and its antecedents, it wouldn't have been for very long. So, but I will say that it was among a handful of bills that I cared about with a certain passion. And so therefore it was very satisfying, but once again, it was a case of watching it and knowing that I was witnessing a historical event. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a run-of-the-mill occurrence by any means, mm-hmm. but it was a bill that was passionately supported. It had a great audience in the galleries. And it's true, it was bipartisan, but it took a while to get to that point. The Republican Party then was a much more amenable party, easy to get to work with. The majority leader had a great relationship with Republican senators. So did I. So did people working for us. A lot of that has changed today, but it was still a conservative party, and the Conservative Party still had a strong tendency to support big business, and that would include timber companies and others. So it was not a slam dunk by any means.
U.S. Chamber of Commerce, I know, with strong opposition.
That too. So a lot of it was a sort of wearing down process. If I might deviate just a little bit, in that general time period, well, in 1964 was the Great Civil Rights Act, the first meaningful act for civil rights since probably the war itself and some of the Reconstruction laws and the amendments to the Constitution about minorities voting. But it was a long stretch, so it was a major act, but it lasted over 80 days and nearly 80 nights. Mansfield's philosophy was he did not lead it, but he chose the lieutenants who did, with Hubert Humphrey being the main strategist and Lee Metcalf being the main presider in the chair whenever there was something serious that was coming up. The Republicans in those days were absolutely against the act. I mean, they stood up, member after member, inveighing against the act, saying why it was bad. The delightful, in his own way, Everett Dirksen, the Wizard of Ooze, they called him because he was such a great spokesman, a very good talker, said it was the end of the republic as we know it, etc., etc. Well, he was speaking mainly to his members, and his members were speaking mainly to their constituents.
But he came around.
Well, this is the thing. The purpose of the filibuster was to keep this subject in front of the American public, and thus the constituents of the various senators, long enough to have their opinions registered, which meant that over time more and more Republicans would peel away from the general party line until at the end of that you had people in line to vote for it, including the minority leader Everett Dirksen.
Or you had Bull Connor from Birmingham, Alabama, on the evening news being shown.
Sure.
Fire hoses.
Sure.
Black demonstrators.
Yeah, you had a lot of extraneous stuff going on at the same time, but by and large, you know that every member of Congress was receiving lots of letters from their constituents saying, vote for it, don't vote for it, and giving the reasons. And as I mentioned earlier, Mansfield, in protecting the decorum of the Senate, would not let the debate go overnight. So we would stop at midnight or 2 in the morning, come back in at 7 or 8 in the morning. He didn't want people coming in typically with their shirt tails out at 3 in the morning, half asleep, etc. They had a couple of unintended effects. One is that for the first time in the history of filibusters, they stayed on the subject. And by staying on the subject, they killed their staffs, because the staffs had to write new and fresh reasons why the housing part of the law was terrible and how some other aspect was terrible, and etc. And so they were probably the most satisfied at having the thing end. The only overnight session was the very last one of the debate. I was the designated staff person. Robert Byrd of West Virginia, who in a bizarre sort of evolution of history became the very next majority leader after Mansfield, he was absolutely against the bill.
A former Klansman.
That's right, and he stood up and he talked for 14 and a half hours, and I sat there for 14 and a half hours while he did his talk. I wore sunglasses, so because the eyes were getting pretty raw by that time. But these are the kinds. While all that was going on, the constituents were involved with every member of Congress, and with the Wilderness Act, obviously it was not of that scale. But the constituency, to the extent that the Wilderness Society and other people could whip them up, and the Sierra Club and the early preservationist groups, that would explain why Republicans slowly dropped their opposition and came around on the Wilderness Act. I don't want to say that that's all cynical, but this is the way the game is often played, and that's the way it was played. So while I heard a lot of anti-wilderness comment from people earlier on, whenever the subject would come up on the floor for the particular act, yes, it was a great display of bipartisanship.
I'm reading into what you're saying, and still today, the importance of constituents to write letters.
Absolutely. Although what I mentioned earlier, the importance is diminished because the members are so busy with other things, they don't have time to see it.
Fundraising.
And it's a case of now letters are computerized. There's you write in on 3 subjects, they get 3 paragraphs for it. They put them in sometimes very poor order, and it's a little mechanical, but you get the gist. And today it's very often, if you wrote a letter to Senator Lee Metcalf and said, I want to see that wilderness, or I hate that wilderness, and I think that you ought to do such and such, his letters would start, I agree with you, and give the reason why, or I do not agree with you, and here's the reason why. I don't want to impugn any of our members of Congress now that is from Montana, because I don't write letters. I work with organizations and they do their thing. But I suspect that the population in Montana which is sure a lot less than that in a New York or California, is still too large for them to be able to concentrate on what you're doing. So a staffer will probably, I shouldn't be saying this, maybe I'm denigrating democracy, but a staffer will be in charge of the computerized response, which the member, if he's conscientious or she is conscientious, will sign and read before it goes out. But this business of I agree with you or I do not agree with you, I'm not sure that you could get a letter out of anybody's delegation today, practically. Whereas surrounding Lee Metcalf were a series of people who would not. Well, Paul Douglas of Illinois was a good friend of Lee's.
Liberal stalwart.
Yeah, right. He was in that cut in that mold. He would not receive a gift from anybody over $3. Lee Metcalf would not receive a gift over $10. His reasoning was that if school kids in Montana wanted to make something and send back to him, and it might have that much in material, etc., he was not about to turn them down. But he was very religious about that. He was, for many years, a member of the Migratory Bird Commission, which is a quasi-independent group to advise the agency. And it had members from both parties and from both houses, and I guess from the public, but certainly agency people. He never missed a meeting. He was faithful. After I became his legislative director and his administrative assistant was replaced by a lady from Roundup, he had built up a really strong body of devotion to the subject matter and to the work, and she and I got a call one day from the Fish and Wildlife Service saying we would like to honor Lee. We would like to give him a carved duck, and you know that whatever he would get would be extraordinary. I mean, it would. And we said, go for it, knowing that that was against his principle. He went to his meeting, he came back, he walked in the door, and he stomped his feet, and he says, who in the goddamn hell set me up? And he was stirred up for a while. He did not accept gifts. That was it. So when people say that he would not have been happy with his name attached to that wilderness area, or especially to a bastardized wilderness area that started out lovingly crafted and then changed, they better believe that he would not be happy.
Mhm.
And if he is capable of sending thunderbolts into Missoula right now to John Melcher, he'd be doing it. So anyway, he was a man of stern character, put it that way. Honest as the day is long, always open about what his feelings were. And this is something, when you write a letter to the member of Congress, you're not likely to get that kind of openness.
Let's go on to another topic that I know you want to talk about. We're in the shadows here of the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness, designated around the time of Lee Metcalf's death. And tell me about that and your connection to it, your thoughts.
Well, of course, my familiarity has been explained, but that's to the Beartooth portion, up on the Hell Roaring Plateau, on to Yellowstone Park, down in what we call the Beartooth Front. Never thought that I would ever be associated with it again at such a level, in such a capacity. So when it was first introduced, I was absolutely delighted. I dealt with Bob Anderson mainly, Bill Cunningham secondarily, and I know that there was a debate in the MWA about whether there should be an Absaroka and a Beartooth, whether they should be combined, and I know that that was a fairly bitter fight in which some people were alienated, and I'm sorry to hear that, but the right decision was made. That was to have a single area. I had one job early on, besides having hearing, etc., and that was to make sure that the boundaries were defensible. The boundaries, some of them were controversial. Near Cook City, we had some remote cabins down along the eastern boundary. But this business about making sure that the boundaries were defensible came into good play later on. We passed the bill out of the Senate, it went to the House, and guess who showed up finding fault with it? John Melcher, to whom and in those days it was not ATVs, the ATVs were practically uninvented. They were people like the Motorcycle Club of Billings, and of course the people who opposed wilderness generally for commercial purposes, etc. And we were still in the throes of the purity argument. So if somebody could make a case that that there was some mark of man that disqualified some area of it, you had to pay attention to it. So that's why I say it was important to make sure that the boundaries were defensible. Melcher kept alive a rumor, an old rumor, that there was once a road from Cook City down to Big Timber. Trail of some sort. The motorcycle people also picked up on that and said, well, one of their number had gone that way one time. We could never figure it out. So we had to write into the bill that if it is determined, you got 10 years to prove it, and if it's determined that there was a public way, and way has a legal meaning, then this issue would be either revisited or you'd have to cut them in two pieces. I am absolutely confident that if they had gone the two area route, instead of having 900,000+ acres, and it would push 1 million if you could go across the Wyoming border and get the natural extension of I don't know, 30 or 40,000 acres, it would make it. Instead of having that block of land protected, I would bet you money that you wouldn't have more than maybe 550,000 acres. There would be a smallish, much smaller Absaroka and a much smaller Beartooth. And if somebody says, you're being too pessimistic, I bet you there would have been 650,000. That's still a big drop. But here's the kicker. That bill was still dead. Melcher's forces had still stopped it. And by that time, Mike Mansfield had retired, had left the Senate, later to become ambassador to China. John Melcher had run successfully for his seat. He was in the Senate. He actually wrote a letter to the head of the Democrats and to the chairman of the Interior Committee asking to be placed on the Interior Committee, which is a no-no. As soon as he arrived, he wrote that letter, which is really quite insulting to his colleague, because you cannot have two people from the same state on the same committee, and he had to have known that. And of course, then he forced Lee Metcalf to have to write to his own chairman and say, this is unheard of, you can't do that, blah, blah, blah. But when Lee died, boy, here he came. He was right on the committee. He was now in a position to make sure that the Absaroka Beartooth didn't go through. When Lee died, Scoop Jackson, senator from the state of Washington, asked his colleagues, and rhetorically to the public, what can we do to memorialize Lee? I mean, I wish I could say with some certainty that my hand was up first. It was certainly up early. Mm-hmm. And we put the word out to Mrs. Metcalf that the Absaroka Beartooth should be his memorial. And for Scoop, that was all it took. He had a majority of the committee. He held a hearing. Melcher came to it and was vintage Melcher and said, well, now, there are still some questions. You understand, I'm not anti-wilderness, but there's still some questions. I mean, what happens if you have a forest fire and it burns the northern slope and the debris washes off into the Yellowstone River? How are we going to service the irrigators downstream? Probably not even being aware that even in the Forest Service, they call it the asbestos forest. It does not burn. That doesn't mean it won't burn sometime. But it was that sort of always holding back, but it went ahead and passed. It passed without him, in effect. And so we were on our way. The next step was to create the map that would be the official map. So Bob Anderson and Bill Cunningham came back to my house in Alexandria, Virginia. I set up sawhorses and a great big plywood table. We stretched out the maps and we drew the boundary of the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness. Whenever there was any question, since they knew the land, I knew the law. I did not say that can't work or that can't work unless it was something in the back of my mind that had been controversial, and then I would grill them. When we were pretty satisfied that everything worked, I went up to the map and I found their boundary that swung just inside, or that is excluded, a tiny lake.
Gertrude.
How did you know? And I drew the boundary to encase it, and so when I retired to Montana, I, my wife, my brother, and his wife took a very nice hike up to see Lake Gertrude. And so I tell people that Lake Gertrude, even though it's my lake, I give everybody permission to view it. But other than that, the boundaries held, the bill passed, it was signed into law, and all of that between the time that Scoop announced that he was going to do the Absaroka-Beartooth to the time that it passed, I do not know how long that'd take, but if I could reconstruct anywhere from 4 days to a week, maybe.
He was a powerful senator.
Yeah,
And well respected.
but it fell on the Billings area with such a rapid thud that there was no time to gin up any kind of opposition to it. So overnight they found that they had this wonderful thing there. Now, even later than that, Melcher announced, I don't know how far he went with this, but toyed with the idea that he was going to go up in the vicinity of Cook City, and he was going to redraw the boundary around a lake up there, exclude it. This was a lake that I didn't know about, that people had raised the issue with Metcalf. It was thoroughly vetted. What the people wanted to do was to mine the bottom of the lake. And Lee says, hell no, but Melcher characterized it to the public that Lee never had an opinion on this, and it was problematical. It was supposed to be included. And of course, I was able to say, absolutely, he included it in his own. So it was a good one. How about Crippen Cabin?
Yes, that's kind of a use of term. Let's go into an MBA business school mode here. Talk case study of Crippen Cabin.
Okay. This is not character assassination in any way. It was a closed effort that was stopped and exposed, and therefore now it is an open issue. We have three players in, as I mentioned earlier, there were three small cabins in the eastern edges of the Beartooth portion of the wilderness. The Forest Service, knowing long before we actually passed the bill, knowing that it was a probability, or at least Lee really cared about it, was going to push it, sent word to three owners of cabins that their leases would not be renewed come a certain date. They'd been in those cabins forever. Those cabins, for the most part, are like so many throughout the forest system that were built by miners who had the right to come in and stake a claim, and they had the right to build housing next to them. And they would do that. Over the years, that's been abused, and a lot of things that started out as is a hovel, or mighty nice, up-to-date cabins that anybody would die for.
The 1872 Mining Act,
There you
signed
go.
by U.S. Grant, is still in effect.
There you go. And two of the occupants graciously said, "Okay, we've had a good run. That's it." The third one came out of the Crippen family, and the person, it was Bruce Crippen's father. Bruce Crippen was a legislator from Billings to Helena for many years. He was at one time the majority leader of the Senate, and in all ways to the public an upstanding gentleman. But he went to the Reagan administration quietly, and the Reagan administration stayed the Forest Service from ousting on schedule. But even then, the Forest Service told him that we will extend your lease, unlike the other two occupants. We'll extend your lease to a certain date, a later date. When that date came, he still had no intention to leave, and he would tell the ranger, who was now a wilderness ranger up there, that in effect, I'm not going anywhere. He knew things that we didn't know. It was sort of frustrating. But he put together, out of sight, an agreement, an arrangement between U.S. Senator from Montana Conrad Burns, Republican, the Chancellor of now MSU Billings, and this scheme would work like this. Crippen would deed the cabin to MSU Billings. Burns would get something passed in law that would mandate the Forest Service to accept any application from MSU Billings to use the property. It was done in the dark of night. It was a rider put on some critically important larger bill. By the time that the National Wilderness Society heard about it and rushed to try to do something about it, it was too late. In the process, they went to Max Baucus, and Max Baucus basically turned his head away. It's nothing I can do about it, but no support. And so with that, we were faced with that. So he introduced it, it passed the Senate, and went to the House. In the House, the bill that went from the Senate to the House did not include the words education. It just would go to the university and for whatever. Some of the House conferees were listening to the Wilderness Society and others, and the best that they could do would say, for educational purposes only. For educational purposes, not only, for educational purposes. And so that's and the wording of the Conrad Burns amendment said that the Forest Service shall accept the application of MSU Billings for a period of 50 years. I've never heard of anything of that kind of length. 50 years is unheard of. At the end of which there will be a public hearing. So, if you're offended by the anti-democracy aspect of this kind of dark of night maneuver, you should be offended. So, when I first went on board the Eastern Wildlands Chapter Board of Directors, the debate was, what do we do? The debate was channeled into another question, which was, how do we make our feelings known to the Forest Service as to what they should do with this property? How should they manage this property that was foisted on them by this dark of night maneuver? I asked the sort of a heretical question, being a newcomer and knowing the Congress, but not knowing exactly how they. Why don't we just stop the chancellor from applying for the permit? And I ran into quite a wall of chatter and opposition, and instead they wanted to debate what the marching order should be for the Forest Service and how they're going to run the cabin. I said, but look, read the language. It says the Forest Service shall accept the application. If he does not apply, there won't be a cabin. I had two of the old timers, gray hairs, people I really respected, etc., said, "You do this, I'm out of here. If you're gonna confront them, that's confrontation, etc." And I knew that confrontation as such really would not work well in a town that was where the newspaper was wedded to the school, and so was the community, and this would be taken in the wrong way. But we had a marvelous president of the chapter, Margaret Webster, who in my opinion was the most dynamic, and hence and more good things happened under her. And I don't want to downgrade any of the other presidents. They did their best, bless them. But we put together a letter and sent it to the chancellor. The chancellor was out of town. As a matter of fact, he was in Hawaii, and he was watching the MSU Billings basketball team play in a tournament out there. You can draw your own conclusions about, whether a chancellor should go that distance to watch a game. And it caught him aback. He told his secretary to open the files, and Margaret and I went up and looked at the files, and we found what we were looking for. We found a document, in effect, talking about Bruce Crippen deeding the in advance, talking about deeding it to MSUB, etc. And once confronted with that, then the chancellor basically was into a back and fill mode all the while. So I basically ended up, and this is not trying to brag about anything, the other people were busier than the devil. I had just recently retired, so I had time to devote to it. But I also understood something about the business of swaying minds of people in elective positions. And the first thing we did was go to an environmental club at MSUB, which was not particularly large or particularly active, but nevertheless got them to pass a resolution saying that the school should not be binding itself to that agreement. The next step was to go to the faculty senate, and there I found a very welcome audience, because the people running it, the tenured longtime faculty, had grievances with the equally long-running chancellor. And faculty politics can be pretty darn devastating. And so they had no problem passing it. As this was happening, the word was starting to seep out, and we couldn't get the Billings Gazette to cover anything. So when Bob Decker, head of the MWA, came down from Helena to Billings on another matter, I took him aside and I said, "Would you back us up if we make an open fight out of this?" And his answer was sort of qualified, but he basically licensed me to do what I could do. I went to the newly formed weekly newspaper in Billings called the Billings Outpost, which was founded by, and I was one of the three founders, but I backed out of it, by David Crisp, who had just resigned from the Billings Gazette so he could start his own newspaper, which was an embarrassing thing to the Gazette. And Bob went with me to see David Crisp. He agreed to do it. He hired, as a freelance writer, a person from Helena whose name escapes me at the moment, but he did a superb job. He wrote the thing up from beginning to end, and that was the beginning of the end. All of this has taken several weeks now, and when the Outpost covered it, the Gazette had to cover it. They covered it in a very neutral fashion. They sent somebody who was not an outdoor person, etc. Very nice lady, very good writer, etc. It was clear that they were not getting into the investigative part of it. So the next question that I asked MWA to give me names of people in various cities, because names of MWA people in various cities, because the Board of Regents was to make the final decision. The Chancellor could make the application, but he had to notify the Board of Regents that he was doing it. When they met in Havre, I had a person, an MWA person, to come down and quiz the Chancellor in open session about this thing. When they met in Dillon, there was another one. And still no decision on whether he was going to make the application. Eventually, and I think it was at the Dillon meeting, here came this meeting, here came this announcement from the Chancellor saying, we have no interest in opening or holding a cabin for educational purposes. Something flat like that. That meant it was over. The Wilderness people were among the happiest, at least some of us here in Billings going on, but equally happy was the Forest Service, because they had been yanked around this. They weren't able to do their job, they weren't able to administer it as a wilderness, etc. And if you know the business of removing material like this, they can destroy it by fire, or they can do something, but they have to come in with a mule train and they have to pack things out, etc., etc. But we could never quite get the story about what was the Forest Service going to do, because I was on pins and needles thinking if this thing carries on long enough, some other end run might be made. But I got the rumor about that the cabin was gone, and again I went up with the group to see it, and sure as the devil, at the height of the forest season, the forest fire season, the Forest Service had burned it down so surgically that trees that overhung it practically only had singed branches. I'm not sure how they did it. But that was the end of it. This is the point, though, that I would make out of all of this, is that I didn't get help from wilderness people on this. They didn't understand. They did not understand that every one of these things where you tug at the fabric of the Wilderness Act and find a loose thread and start pulling it diminishes our fight to save wilderness. So in that sense, it was a serious attack on the Wilderness Act. One of the techniques that I used in trying to sway the Chancellor and the faculty there was to say that we will mount a campaign, an internet campaign with the young people of the United States. Facebook and Twitter wasn't really in vogue at that time yet. It was just starting to come that way, but we would put out the word that the environmental program at MSUB, even though you're right here next to the wilderness and all of those reasons to come here, is a fraud. The faculty of the political science department and others who knew what was going on, and they're teaching good government practices to their students, were paying no attention to this, or certainly had no voice in it. That if this is going to be an anti-democracy way their own institution is going to run, they should be sanctioned for it. So, as a case study in what you should and shouldn't do, and as a case study of what the Wilderness Act really should mean, I mean, it's a good one. And I invite anybody who watches this thing I have papers that will not quit. I have documentation. I have emails. A lot of good stuff that somebody in a history department somewhere who wants to challenge a student not just at the master's level, but at the PhD level, as a case study in democratic action and a case study in preservation, please come and talk to me.
This is inspiring, and this is one thing that I really look for with this history project and interviewing people like yourself, is envision, I mean, we're talking 50 years from now,
Yeah.
these issues are not
Yeah.
going to go away.
Yeah.
People coming into the Blue Zone and researching and watching you talk about this inspiring story of one person, some other instances one or more,
Yeah.
who are willing to be courageous, and I really mean emphasis on the word courageous, to fight for something and not give up, to be tenacious. Because we can be in a world sometimes where there's a lot of cynicism, passivity, or at least inactivity relating to public lands issues. And sometimes all it takes is one person. When I talk to people from Butte or Dillon, where sometimes the grassroots support for wildlands is not so great, one person can make a difference. And this is an inspiring story for people, whether it's a month from now or 50 years from now, to watch this story.
Well, I appreciate very much the opportunity to give it. And I'm thankful to the MWA to have this oral history project, because it's not just my story. There are other people. We have had some fantastic people, some fantastic fights in Montana. Everybody is the winner. Whenever we win, everybody wins. And otherwise, with regard to that cabin, which did not lend itself to educational purposes, one of the faculty types, well, a handful of faculty went up there, came back and told the chancellor that they didn't really see it as a viable educational tool. And they took a bunch of kids with them, and when they got up there, the kids were ready to head out at 4 o'clock and go back down the trail to their cars and back to rooms where they could sleep in beds. Sadly, today's students, and especially in areas where they flock to Montana from metropolitan areas in the east and elsewhere, have never had the opportunity to sleep on the floor or to do whatever was necessary. So,
Go to a place where the cell phones don't work.
right, there were plenty of previous indications to me that we had a winning argument, and as long as the chancellor held off, we were going to win it. But otherwise, today we would be looking for the next, 35, 6, 7 years until that thing expired, and we could have a public hearing.
Right.
That's
Who knows what would
and how many precedents in other areas would follow this lead.
We talk about the stature and effectiveness of Lee Metcalf. I want to cite an article from the Helena Independent Record in June 26 of 1977 relating to the Battle of the Montana Wilderness Study Act, and talking about John Melcher. And Lee Metcalf responding and talking about John Melcher's statements as inaccurate, these are quotes, irrelevant and misleading statements relating to the Montana Wilderness Study Act, which was hugely important.
Well, and hugely unique and unusual. And that was outside of his office. Inside of his office, sometimes it was a different thing. No, it's the man is worthy. We live in an age where the Congress is held in low esteem and its members in low esteem, and that's very unfortunate because there are many, many members in both parties who are just super fine people. They're being whipsawed back and forth. But if you wanted to have an exemplar after whom you could name a Lee Metcalf Award or something like that, you could not do better. You simply could not do better. And I'm a great fan of Mike Mansfield. He just brought different qualities to the table. Mm-hmm. But we are talking wilderness. And he was recently inducted into the Hall of Fame of the Montana Historical Society. And I went up and talked, and I said what I'm saying here might be considered heresy to some people who liked both of our duo. But in his later years, Mansfield was interviewed by a person. I'm pretty sure that and I have a copy of it, the interview appeared, I believe, in the national publication of the Wilderness Society. But he was asked, in effect, how would he rate the senators from Montana all time? And he was so self-effacing that he would not permit a biographer to write his story. I think it's just a terrible loss to mankind. He was so self-effacing that you would expect him maybe to say what he said, but I know him well enough, I knew him well enough to know that he was saying the absolute truth. The greatest senator from Montana was Lee Metcalf.
Wow.
He would put himself in third or fourth place, he said. And I told the group there, although I was endorsing Lee for inclusion into the Hall of Fame, that I absolutely agree that Lee was the greatest senator from Montana, in the sense that he dealt with Montana everything. And that when you folks leave this audience and you go out in your cars and you head for the parts of Montana where you live, guarantee you within 100 miles, and certainly maybe 200 to 300 miles, you will see a mountain range and it'll just rise up above you and it will look terrific. You can be assured that there is a wilderness area around or on top of that thing, and you can be assured that you're seeing Lee Metcalf's monuments. He was a person who stood for the people from day one. The writings of Fred Swanson are just excellent about his origins and how he became an environmentalist. But he continued to be a man of the people, and the people in that time wanted things that the New Deal had. They wanted dams, they wanted electricity, they wanted all these things. He was great for education, he was great for this wide range of progressive issues. Well, after he died, the world moved past him, the American political scene moved past him. Those things that he stood for, whether it was education, we now see the creation of charter schools and the firing of teachers and etc. All of those have been compromised, some of them badly. The one thing that remains is his wilderness legacy. So while he wasn't a one-trick pony, wilderness wasn't his only thing. He worked really, really hard on all kinds of things. This is the one that endures. So his monuments endure, his memory should endure better than it does, and I hope that under the auspices of the Montana Wilderness Association, they will revive it.
These are inspiring words, and I appreciate this, and it's a great way for the audience to get motivated to go out and work, because I really sometimes get concerned about cynicism and negativism. Nothing good really comes out of it, and it can create a vacuum for opponents and people who will exploit that vacuum for their own self-interest, to the destruction, really, of the public at large.
And all organizations get co-opted, or they're run by the next generation, people who have lost some of the fire, some of the knowledge, until you in too many cases you find people that I wouldn't say are not worthy of being followed, but they don't say follow me. They don't say here's what we have to do, come join me. I mean it becomes a I would say more of a business than a mission, but the business aspect of it compromises the mission. Lee was somebody who never got compromised. John Seiberling was never compromised. Mike Mansfield was never compromised. They're the kind of, and those heroes are here today, many of them. You can be elected into a delegation and you won't find the kind of a partner that Lee and Mike found, or you won't find the situation the same. It makes it much more difficult, but there are very good people there.
This is a legacy that all Montanans can be proud of.
Absolutely. And I want to, if we're nearing the end of this, give you one more story,
Please.
which I had a hand, and I'm proud of it. But it's one that that still gets told by especially people, friends in the Missoula area. We would get letters from people of every stripe. Intelligent, not so intelligent, for, against, etc. But we got a letter from a gentleman in Missoula giving Lee Metcalf unshirted hell for his policies, public land policies, and representing himself as a member of the Posse Comitatus. And for those who don't know what it is, Google it and look it up, because there's actually is an early legal term, the Posse Comitatus. And Lee answered him in a really short letter that said, "Dear so-and-so, thank you for your letter on behalf of the Posse Comitatus Idiotus. It will get the attention it deserves." What makes the story complete is the guy then ran to the Missoulian to show him what this member of Congress, how rude he was and how wrong he was. So he helped. So thank you for your letter on behalf of the Posse Comitatus Idiotus. It will get the attention it deserves. We need more people who say what they mean. Let the chips fall where they may. Another thing, Lee says, give me 50% of the vote plus one, and I will be happy, because if I lose an election, it simply means at a given time the public does not agree with me. It does not diminish my worth or my humanity, and he never lost an election.
There's something more important than getting reelected to political office.
That's correct.
Personal character
Yep.
and values.
And again, the three people I worked for, I know people who worked in Congress for many, many years and never drew a single hero. I drew three of them, and it was an extraordinary experience. And I've gone on to do some other really interesting things that do not belong in a wilderness talk, but those really stood out.
On that fantastic note of your statements there, I think it's a great time to end today's conversation.
Okay.
Very inspiring words for a long time to come. And I thank you very much, Teddy, and I look forward to more discussions on this with you and coming to Billings.
Okay, and I look forward to continuing working on behalf of Wilderness as long as I can, and working with the MWA and all good people.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.